The leak, a mole with a front row seat. Silence was the armor. It was also the tell. The same few rooms, the same faces, the same Thursdays, patterns tight enough to be read by anyone close enough to feel the heat off the coffee. The leak didn't sit at the head table. He sat 2 chairs back with access to logistics, not coordinates, to travel rosters, not target names. That was enough. Rhythm beats secrets. He handled the boring gold, purchase orders for exotic bearings, rush shipments of drill pipe couplings, hotel blocks near Redwood City and Long Beach that lined up with engineering reviews. The memos he touched used phrases like summer window, station keeping tolerance, and Hughes cover elements. He couldn't print them. He didn't need to. He memorized cadence. What did he pass? Not K129, not latitude and longitude. He passed a metronome, a ship of unprecedented design, a timed weather breath in late July into early August, a cover story that would require oceanographic pantomime, and a delicate lift that demanded weeks on station. He drew no maps. He traced the drumbeat of a mission that couldn't afford an audience. On the Soviet side, a subtle choreography began. Orders in Vladivostok and Petropavlovsk shifted by inches. Research. Hulls with nets they rarely wet received fuel to loiter along lanes that weren't productive for fish, but were perfect for watching patients. Trawlers carried antennas that didn't match their tonnage. Hydrographic ships scheduled, sampling, arcs through squares that mirrored an American weather model you could build from open forecasts. Back home, small alarms flickered and died in compartments. A Navy auditor noticed exotic alloys funneled through a shell that didn't do oil. An NSA analyst flagged maritime chatter about industrial sampling in grid boxes where nobody used to care. A CIA security officer logged 2 odd job queries for front office. Same mispronunciation of the company name, same script of harmless questions. Each alert hit a wall called Need to Know and slid to the floor. The mole didn't rush. He kept his valve half open, passing tempo, not trivia. When the build schedule compressed to make the weather window, Soviet loiter patterns compressed too. When barge traffic out of Long Beach threaded a mild forecast, fishing tracks stitched a parallel seam across empty sea. It wasn't proof in a court. It was proof in a watchstander's gut. Inside the program, tension spread in quiet ways. A young engineer asked why trawlers kept showing up near a California test area. His boss told him to run the numbers and ignore the horizon. A procurement clerk started taking different routes to work because a sedan she didn't recognize showed up twice too often. A case officer walked out of a meeting early, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. Silence had grown edges. Here's the knife's twist. The tighter the compartments, the clearer the outline. When a program stops making noise in one city and starts humming in another, the gap glows for anyone mapping absences. The cover mining wasn't failing. It was succeeding so consistently that its reliability became a signature. Real science is messy. This science kept perfect time. Some inside argued for a delay. Shift the window. Change the resupply lanes. Scramble the rhythm. Budgets, contracts, and North Pacific weather answered back. The clock was cooking the plan. Thrusters had been tuned, heave compensation tested, HMB1 scheduled. A pause would trigger questions up and down a supply chain that already looked like a board with too many pushpins. Meanwhile, the mole watched his own risk curve. He never named ships. He never named men. He never touched the coordinates vault. He passed phrases and tempo to a handler who preferred fragments to fireworks. The handler understood the ocean's math. You don't need a street address to be present. You need a reason to wait in the right neighborhood. Stakes turned human. If the other side parked nearby, calm and patient, the lift had to be perfect. No jolts, no pauses, no hiccup that would throw a shadow on a deck camera. If a partial recovery happened, the worst case wasn't embarrassment. It was arriving home with fragments while your adversary arrived home with confidence. Confidence is doctrine fuel. There were moments when proof almost surfaced. A memo months later would show a Soviet trawler extending its loiter exactly when the Glomar's testing got shaved to hit the window. A comms tech would match harmless lab bursts to shift changes on heave comp. A contracting conduit would decline a promotion that cut his visibility. choosing access over money. Each clue was a bead. Nobody strung them before the ship sailed. The leak wasn't glamorous, it was granular. It didn't blow a cover, it tuned an audience. The mission's strength, predictable competence under a flawless mask, became the thing the other side counted on. They'll be there then, doing that for this long. That sentence doesn't need a map. It needs a chair, a radio, and patience. Psychology, not physics, set the trap. People love rhythms. Planners love schedules. Engineers love windows. Operators love rehearsals. The mole didn't fight those loves. He surfed them. By the time the Glomar's paint dried, the Soviets didn't have to guess. They had a pulse to match. And out in the box where steel would meet its old grief, an audience took its seats without clapping. Building the Leviathan, the Glomar Explorer comes alive. They started by teaching a ship to lie. Hull plates went down broad and calm. A rectangle of steel meant to sit like a table in angry water. Below the waterline, thrusters circled her like muscles around a spine, each ready to nudge her back when wind and swell tried to push. At the center was the secret, a moon pool, a mouth in the belly where the ocean could rise inside, unseen. Industry on the outside, espionage in the core. Launched in June 1974 under the Hughes banner, the Glomar Explorer had to do 3 jobs at once. Be a believable mining platform, hold station over a point the size of a tennis court, and swallow a Soviet submarine in silence. Stakes were everywhere. Drift 10 feet, and 3 miles of pipe would twist like a spring. Stall a moon pool door, and the capture vehicle would hang between daylight and cover. Blink on the control system, and every joint would feel a jolt. It wasn't designed to survive. Action looked like welding arcs, sleepless benches, and arguments with needles on gauges. Global Marine's dynamic positioning brain grew out of racks of gyros and analog computers that turned wind and wave into math a hull could obey. Heave compensation rams, tall as trees, learned a strange ballet. Push when the ocean pulled, yield when it shoved. So the pipe didn't pick up the ship's breathing. Controllers drilled handovers at the console because hands get tired long before steel admits it. Meanwhile, in a sealed bay, Clementon took form. Not a cartoon claw, more a lattice of ribs and sills built to bear on frames, not thin plating. Fingers hinged and rehinged as metallurgists argued over alloys that wouldn't turn brittle in cold, high pressure. Pressure pads turned contact into numbers the operators could feel with their eyes. Cameras peered from armored housings beside floodlights with shrouds, so backscatter wouldn't blind the pilots in their own snowstorm of silt. A problem kept slipping out of meetings like a draft. Crush risk. Soviet steel had been shocked by catastrophe, then salted for 6 years at roughly 16,500 feet. The claw had to be strong and gentle at once, so they spread load. More beams, more sills, more weight. Every pound walked back up the pipe math and landed on deck as a new argument with ballast and joint stress. The system held on paper, but paper prefers perfect weather. Logistics became a magic trick you could watch and still not see. The Hughes mining barge, HMB-1, hid Clementon inside a floating box. Crews assembled, tested, and mated the capture vehicle away from lenses, then flooded the barge, sank it, and let the ship rise above to take delivery through the moon pool. In port, the choreography had to look boring. Pipe joints with fresh threads received serials, inspections, and anti-gall compound, then stacked like cordwood with just enough theatre. The descent, contact with the dead. They waited for a weather breath that wasn't kind, just less cruel. Then a quiet word on the net. Begin. The drill floor woke up. Pins clacked, tongs bit, and the first joint of pipe slid through the moon pool into black water that ate light like it was hungry. Joint after joint followed, each one talked, stamped, logged. The ship held her spot like a man holding his breath, thrusters whispering corrections no eye could see. Stakes were simple and heavy. 3 miles of steel hung from the belly of a ship that couldn't drift a dozen feet without putting torsion into every thread. Heave compensation groaned and breathed, turning the ocean's punch into something the pipe could forgive. If a joint seized at depth, nobody could walk it off with a wrench. If the string bowed, it could whip and shear. There was no backup plan that didn't end in silence. The descent felt like hours poured into a long, dark funnel. Operators watched needles and numbers as if they were faces. Tension climbed in a careful staircase. Talk settled, then twitched when a wave and a gust found each other. The compensators pushed back and the twitch smoothed. You don't fix the sea. You coax it into forgetting you exist. Meanwhile, on the grey edge of the box, 2 Soviet trawlers drifted like they had nowhere better to be. Nets went down, came up clean, went down again. Antennas, a size too proud for fishing, turned slowly, staring at a sky that looked empty. They weren't hunting fish. They were measuring time. Clementine took weight with a shudder you felt in deck plates. Cameras bloomed into snow, silt, plankton, backscatter. Floodlights carved tunnels that ended in brown fog. Sonar painted a low hill where broken frames had become terrain. The voice on the downlink kept the room small. 5 degrees starboard, ease, hold. Fingers opened and closed in patient tests, the pressure pads sending back a language of force the pilots learned by feel. Touchdown wasn't a thud, it was a negotiation. The capture fingers slid under torn edges and backed away from plating that would crumble if hugged. They searched for ribs that still remembered being strong. A pad read a number that said enough. Another read, not yet. They moved in millimeters. You can't muscle a dead boat at 16,500 feet. You ask it to come with you. Up top, nobody passed coffee. Men stared at gauges like they were windows. A chief who never prayed before prayed now, not for triumph, just for no surprises. A case officer pressed his thumb into his palm until it hurt, because the pain kept his mind from wandering to what bodies would look like in cold black water. A young engineer mouthed numbers like they were charms. Lock the first hinge. The pipe sang a note you couldn't hear so much as feel in your teeth. Lock the second. The ship trimmed ballast and settled, the compensators exhaling to keep the string from remembering the hull's breath. The pads read evenly enough across 3 points. Someone let out a breath like he was afraid the air would tip the scale. The lift began in whispers. 1 ton less on the mud, 1 ton more on the ship. Suction didn't let go. It argued. The operators eased ascent speed to a number that looked like patience. Telemetry flickered when a camera kissed silt and went blind, then came back in static and grit. The computer kept the flags green, except for 1 blink when wind and swell tried to line up. Thrusters hunted, found, and the blink died. Halfway off the bottom, the pipe carried the story of every wave the hull had met. Tiny torsion pulses ran down the string like gossip. Metallurgists somewhere on shore had warned about fatigue breeding in threads. On deck, the warnings became a small superstition. Nobody said good when a number held. They said steady and looked away. Meanwhile, in the grey, a trawler's skipper took a note from a man who didn't look like a fisherman. Maintain course. Report anomalous soundings. The skipper shrugged. He'd been paid to be patient. Patience was easy when the radio stayed quiet and the sea was a slate. At depth, Clementine climbed with a grace that didn't belong to steel. Then a groan came up the pipe like a long, slow regret, not a snap, a decision. Telemetry hiccuped, then climbed in a jagged run. The operator whispered to the ship and trimmed to dead slow. The trace stuttered again. Weight shifted in a way that meant the wreck wasn't a single thing anymore. 2/3 of the hull gave up in a rush that felt like weather moving through metal. Tension dropped hard, paused, dropped again. Something heavy fell away into black, silent for a long count, then a slow thud came back as a vibration in the string. The room listened to absence. The operator kept the climb alive by ounces. Up through the moon pool came the smell first. Old oil, salt, something like a harbor at night. The piece rose slow, bent plating, a slice of bulkhead, cables that once carried orders, and bodies, not many, enough to take the air out of the deck. Work stopped without anyone calling it. Later accounts would say several remains were recovered and given burial at sea with honors. In that moment, men looked away, then looked back, because respect is a kind of steadiness too. The lift continued in inches. Ballast shifted to tame a center of gravity that had moved somewhere inconvenient. The pipe creaked like a door thinking about its hinges. Numbers held. The ship breathed without passing it down the string. The ocean didn't cheer. It doesn't do that. It grades. On the grey horizon, the trawlers didn't surge or flee. They just were like facts. Calm, patient, present. The audience a good heist never wants. And on a steel deck far from any shore, men learned what it feels like when physics keeps its promises and mercy does not. The break, what fell back into the dark. It didn't fail like a movie prop. It failed like something old remembering how to let go. A long, low groan traveled up the pipe, through the decks into teeth. Not a crack, a surrender. The tension trace jagged upward, then dipped like it had missed a step. One word on the net, hold. Stakes turned from theory to anatomy. If the load tore free all at once, the pipe could whip, joints could unzip, the moon pool could become a mouth that bit its own tongue. If it let go in pieces, falling sections could scythe the string, twist Clementine sideways into knives made from frames. Worst of all, a partial cling could turn the whole assembly into a lever with no fulcrum, asking weak joints to act strong. Action crowded the room. Controllers eased ascent speed until the number looked like stillness. Heave comp breathed in quarter notes, stealing inches from waves before the ocean could pass its punch to the pipe. Thrusters whispered against one another to keep the hull pinned to a box no eye could see. Downlink showed snow, then a smear of structure, then nothing but grit again. Somewhere below, load redistributed itself with the logic of corrosion. A high metallic whine peeped from a clamp and died when an operator stole a few pounds from the string. Another hiccup on the trace. Then a sudden, heavy absence, like a thought removed mid-sentence. Tension dropped a third in one blink, paused in a mean stillness, then dropped again. Something large was falling away into black where nothing falls quickly. Men counted beats they couldn't hear and felt a soft thud return as a shiver in steel. 2/3 gone. Not a measurement, a feeling. The remaining piece tugged off-center, shifting the center of gravity so the spine above had to relearn itself. Ballast tanks took on and bled water like lungs in a slow panic. The dynamic positioning brain trimmed and retrimmed. A controller whispered to a machine he called she, and steady in the same breath. The room didn't breathe, the ship did. Inch by inch, the pipe remembered it was a column and not a whip. The ascent became a crawl that wouldn't scare a snail. Nobody said almost. They said numbers. They said copies. They said Roger. They didn't say good. Up through the moon pool, the survivor surfaced like a memory that refused to stay buried. The smell arrived first, old oil, salt, and rust so fine it tasted like pennies. Bent plating, a slice of bulkhead, cable snarls that once carried commands, scars that didn't belong to collapse alone, and bodies, few, still, and preserved by cold. Work paused without orders. Men took off gloves as if bare hands could apologize. Later, they would be wrapped, honored, and given to the sea with words that crossed borders better than politics. Shock moved in straight lines. The team secured what they had like it was both evidence and a guest. Straps found steel. Tags found surfaces. Cameras found angles that told stories without telling all of them. A chaplain without a title spoke in a voice that made men stand a little straighter. The burial was quiet on purpose. Flags, music damped by wind, simple words, no chest beating. The film would live in a safe, and then in a second country years later. Back at the console, nobody could afford reverence long. A shifted center meant every foot up was a new problem. The pipe creaked like a hinge deciding whether to be loyal. Heave comp kept the ship's breath from walking down the string. One bad gust lined up with one honest swell and tried to lean the world. Thrusters argued back and won by a hair. The operators trimmed ascent to a crawl that felt like penance. Across the grey horizon, the trawlers didn't change speed. They didn't blink. They didn't even look interested. They simply were present, patient, confident enough to make absence feel like proof. If they were guessing, it was a precise guess. If they weren't, the calm was earned. Either way, the message landed. They'd budgeted for our ambition, and their math held. In the control room, the vocabulary shifted to survival. Partial recovery took shape as a phrase that comforted budgets and bruised pride. Engineers said anomalous fracture because steel likes that word better than broke. Metallurgists would later draw neat lines through torn metal and call them logical. A chief stared at those lines and heard a sentence without consonants. You were never bringing the whole thing home. What the deck crew saw was simpler. The ocean kept most of what it had taken and lent back a lesson.